Hi, I'm Dr. Corey Miller, president of Hsiao Christi. We are on 150 university campuses from Rutgers to University of Washington and from Purdue University to Rice University and beyond. Today's episode of Thoughtful Christianity is about God and guns. Our guest today is Tim Hsiao. Tim is a part-time police officer and weapons instructor, as well as an assistant professor of philosophy and humanities at University of Arkansas Grantham campus. His work specializes in ethics, social and political philosophy, areas that I rather enjoy. He's been variously published in peer-reviewed journals. Some of his many articles include titles like Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammo, How to Think About the Gun Control Debate, The Moral Case for Concealed Carry on Campus, The Ethics of Gun-Free Zones, among many others. Among all of our vodcast interviews thus far on Thoughtful Christianity, Tim is the first one to be interviewed as a former Hsiao Christi student. He was the student president at a chapter in Florida and received the Legatus Christi award. Legatus Christi means in Latin, ambassador of Christ. And it's an award given for academic rigor, for denoting someone who pursues God with their mind, demonstrates Christ-like character, engages others in evangelism with compassion and respect, and is willing and able to teach others with exponential impact. Past recipients include those serving as clerk for Supreme Court Justice right now, ministry leaders, and professors. And with that, Tim, welcome to Thoughtful Christianity. Great to have you on here.
Thanks. I'm pleased to be here.
Good. Hey, in short time, you've become a prolific author, writing in both the pop and scholarly levels. Tell us what drives you as a philosopher and in philosophical writing in that regard.
I like to write about topics that make people very upset sometimes. I sort of made a little niche for myself in picking issues that I would regard, many of us would regard as common sense, things that people don't really question. But in the academic world, those views aren't popular, or those views are regarded as silly, outdated, nonsensical, or otherwise indefensible. And so some of my first papers were on the morality of owning guns, the morality of eating meat, which has actually gotten me quite a bit of interaction with people, including death threats from animal rights activists.
Wow.
But I pick topics that are relevant, that mostly are on issues relating to ethics or political philosophy. So, drug legalization, the ethics of corporal punishment, immigration, gun ownership, all these different things. And I write, in defense of the traditional conservative Christian position on it, or should I say the Christian position on those topics. And I've done quite a bit of that. I usually just identify a topic that in the literature hasn't received very much attention. And then I say to myself, well, how can I write a good paper on this topic that is both academically rigorous, but also written in a way that could be assigned in an introductory level undergraduate class. And that's really my goal in writing these papers. I want to put out a good defense of a position that can be read by somebody who is a freshman or sophomore in college, something that can be widely disseminated, that can get maximum exposure. Because I write to an academic audience, but not just an academic audience. I want these views to be disseminated. I want the ideas to sort of permeate the culture and make an impact.
Right. And I can see why, a lot of people can't make that translation. It's one reason that as I was studying philosophy, I wanted to focus on ethics because I wanted to relate to the world. And people in metaphysics and epistemology, half the world doesn't even know how to pronounce epistema what or meta who. I remember when I was in grad school at Purdue, we had a famous philosopher that you would know well, Richard Swinburne, one of the top maybe 3 philosophers in philosophy of religion, came to give a colloquium talk in our department. And as you know, the game sometimes in philosophy is you read a paper and you stop reading it, you're finished, and the name of the game is the first person in the audience to take the author down wins. Non-contact sport sometimes. Well, Richard Swinburne was giving a talk on God and morality, and just right in the middle of his lecture, you heard this screeching sound. And I thought, oh my goodness, I knew there were some jerks in the department, but come on, at least let him finish first and then maybe take him down. But it turned out one of the philosophy faculty had fallen out of his chair and he was having a seizure. I had never seen that before. And suddenly a bunch of philosophy faculty were gathering around him, and one of them popped up and he said to everybody else, "Is there a doctor in the house? Is there a doctor in the house?" All the hands raised. "I have a doctorate. I have a doctorate. I have a doctorate." No, a real doctor. So some people look at that, an illustration like that, and think, yeah, that's fitting. Philosophy is very cerebral. It's not really relevant for most people in life. Why do you find, I mean, you do applied ethics. Why do you find philosophy to be practical when most people think that it's entirely too cerebral?
Well, not only that it's too cerebral, a lot of my undergraduate students, that they don't have any exposure to philosophy, and I ask, well,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think philosophy is? Give me some words that you would associate with philosophy. Well, some of the words I get are meditation, crystals, new
Yeah.
age, inner peace, enlightenment, which I think that is what a lot of people think about philosophy. It's on the one hand, some people think it's cerebral, but also some people think it's obscurantist. It's a bunch of profound sounding jargon that you could put on a bumper sticker, you could put on a sign, like as a meme, but there's no actual depth to it. It's very subjective, and I don't look at philosophy that way. I teach a lot of logic classes. In fact, I teach the core gen ed critical thinking class at my
Mm.
university, and a lot of people go into it not really having taken a class like that before. Many people will say that, well, in my previous classes, I read a book and I memorized the definitions and I just spouted it out in the test or quiz, and that's it. But I make my students think on their feet. I tell them philosophy is about, among many things, it's about careful analysis, careful reasoning to determine what's really true and what's really good and worth pursuing. And so the first thing I drill into people in my classes is that, hey, we're all interested in the truth. We might have different views on what constitutes the truth, but the fact that you're going to a school right now, the fact that you are inquisitive means that you want to get the right answers. And philosophy, the love of wisdom, is about helping you find those right answers. And those right answers are relevant to how you live your life, to the way you pursue things, to what you consider good, to what you consider noble and worthwhile. And everybody wants to pursue the good life. Everyone pursues the good. They might have different conceptions of the good, but the goal of philosophy that I teach my students is to help us pursue what's good, so identify what's good and true, and to pursue it. And so, if you think of philosophy as just one-upmanship against each other, winning arguments, saying profound things, then I can see how somebody might get a bad view of philosophy as it's sophistry or just pure nonsense. But I think those are misconceptions of philosophy. And once you understand what philosophy actually is, what it can do, how it can be practical, critical thinking is very relevant. I mean, if you just want to look at that sort of perspective, you can't do well in the business world. You can't do well, as a person in this, in today's society. And for example, I'm a law enforcement officer part time. You got to be able to think critically. The decisions you make, you want to make good decisions. And so having those logic and critical thinking skills is very helpful. Ethics is also very important. We all have an idea of what's good and what we want to pursue, how we want to do it. But many times we don't have the right idea of what's truly good and what's truly fulfilling for us. And in studying ethics, you can understand and learn, how do we make moral decisions? How can you make
Right.
a choice that really advances your flourishing as opposed to, an idea of the good that doesn't actually um, advance what you should be doing and the kind of person you should be.
Right. Very good. Very good. And speaking of good, we want to talk here about Christian ethics and get right onto it, talking about God and guns, Christian ethics and guns. I appreciate when I, saw that you became a police officer. 1990, I enlisted in the Army, and I didn't want to take free money. That was just my kind of libertarian conservative view as a new Christian. Didn't take the Pell Grant that I was awarded. Instead, I wanted to earn it and go off and get a GI Bill. And I became a military police officer. Got to boot camp, and suddenly we bombed Iraq for invading Kuwait. And now I had to really ask the question as a fairly new Christian, am I willing to shoot someone? We're being prepared to be shipped over to Iraq, and I had to reconcile in my mind now this stuff could really come down. And I thought, well, most of them might be Muslims. I don't really think they're going to heaven. And so maybe I'll just shoot them in the kneecap if I have to. Well, but what if they shoot my, fellow soldier? And I just had to wrestle with that. Sure, in the Old Testament, people killed one another, but Jesus said he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. Who or what would Jesus shoot? Aren't followers of Jesus supposed to be pacifists? That is, we shouldn't be shooting people, should we?
So it's an interesting question. I've just published a paper on this topic in a peer-reviewed journal, and I look at a specific passage in Luke 22:36. Jesus tells his followers to sell their cloak and buy a sword. Now, the whole context of that passage, it's the Last Supper. Jesus is alluding to an earlier part of the Gospels where he sends his disciples out and says, don't take all these things with you, just rely on them to be provided to you. But at this time, he is talking to his disciples and he says, basically, look, all the special providence you enjoyed while I was with you is soon going to come to an end. The scripture is going to find its fulfillment. I'm going to be crucified and you'll be on your own. And so he says, if you don't have a money bag or knapsack or sword, obtain these things. In fact, he says, sell your cloak and buy a sword. Well, a cloak in that time was a very important piece of property. We're told, I believe in Exodus, that it's something that if it's used as collateral, it should be returned because someone's not going to have appropriate clothing for the night. And so the importance of a sword is sandwiched in between all these different other items to show that it's our responsibility to be self-reliant, to have a money bag, to have a knapsack, and to have a sword. These all address different parts of taking care of ourselves. And so Jesus is explicitly encouraging his disciples in that passage to take necessary measures to defend themselves, buying a sword. Now, the common response to that will be, well, Jesus rebukes Peter for using the sword.
Right.
He lives by the sword, will die by the sword. But notice what Jesus is saying when he rebukes Peter. He says, and there's each gospel portrays it differently, but Jesus says, put your sword back in its place, implying that there is a place for the sword. Now, when Jesus says, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, he's not sort of unilaterally condemning swords. He's saying, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. And in that context, what is going on is that the disciples, Peter namely, is trying to interfere with God's plan for Jesus by taking things into his own hands. And that's what Jesus is speaking out against. He's not speaking out against the use of swords. Otherwise, he wouldn't have instructed his disciples to obtain a sword. He's saying that, look, using a sword for this purpose, namely interfering with what God has for me, that's not going to get you anywhere. And if you do that, if you use the sword as sort of a spiritual antidote, then you will die by the sword. But he's not unilaterally condemning swords as such. In fact, like I said earlier, he encourages the disciples to obtain a sword in Luke 22:36. One other response is that, well, the point of obtaining a sword in that passage is so that Jesus can look like a criminal, and so that he can be convicted as a rabble rouser, as a revolutionary, and so the purpose of the sword is to facilitate Jesus's appearance as a common criminal. Well, in the paper I mentioned, I give I believe, 5 reasons for rejecting that interpretation. One, it doesn't make sense in the money bag and knapsack. If the purpose of the sword was to make Jesus appear that night as a criminal, why would he also say, obtain a money bag and knapsack? Those don't have any relevance to that specific, that narrow um, context. It's a more plausible interpretation that in referring to the money bag, knapsack, and sword, he's referring to self-reliance in general at a future time when he's no longer there. Plus, it also fits the timing. Jesus is telling his disciples during the Last Supper to obtain a sword. Well, who's going to have a sword around to sell at that time? And so I give 5 reasons to reject the fulfilled prophecy interpretation of the sword reference. I think the sword is, as the scripture says, plain reading of that passage, I think, is, do all these things so that you can take care of yourself.
Yeah, when we ask the question, what would Jesus shoot, or who would he shoot? We might respond back, well, he wouldn't shoot anyone. Had he a weapon like that, he probably wouldn't. He wouldn't take the sword. But I think sometimes, don't you agree, we need to be careful when asking the what would Jesus do questions too, because we've got to contextualize that. His mission was, as the Messiah, to go to the cross, right? And there are other things he wouldn't do either. He wouldn't have sexual intercourse. Unless maybe he was the Mormon Jesus. That was my background. But, that doesn't mean that Christian fathers or non-Christian fathers, that God doesn't approve of sexual intercourse. But that's what you have to do to have children. So just because we can't affirm everything the way that Jesus might do it, we have to contextualize that too. And I appreciate you putting context into understanding the Bible. That's the greatest way to deviate. You can make it say anything you want it to say if you don't pay attention to context, right? Well, there is a lot of heating up about gun control right now, especially sensitive due to all the recent school and worksite shootings. And I think the Christian ethic is not far off from our moral intuitions. As Christians, we would say, well, we all have this residue, this moral law inside of us. We were able to discern moral thinking because we've been created in God's image, and we can map onto that. But first, before we get to that, I want to bring to attention a recent legal case in the State versus Dodson, where the Supreme Court of Wisconsin cited your Public Affairs Quarterly article titled "The Moral Right to Keep and Bear Arms." It seemed to invoke a hit and run situation, followed by mistaking the vehicle with someone else's, and then an innocent guy getting shot. So a piece of your writing has actually been recently cited in a Wisconsin Supreme Court case. Tell us more about that legal case and the relevance of your article cited in it.
Yeah, it's not common as a philosopher to have your article cited in a court decision. And so I was surprised when I saw that citation. But the paper was cited in a dissenting opinion. So you have majority opinions and dissenting opinions. I believe 3 or 4 of the justices signed on to that dissenting opinion. The case concerned an individual who was sentenced for, I believe, second-degree homicide. And it was a self-defense case involving a gun. And the court used the fact that he lawfully owned and carried a gun as a sentence modifier to impose a more heavy prison sentence on him. And the question at hand was, does lawfully owning a gun and carrying it, is that a reason to impose a harsher sentence on someone? The majority opinion said yes in that case. The dissenting opinion, which cited my paper, said no, you can't impose a harsher sentence on someone for doing something that's lawful. And so my paper was cited in the dissenting opinion, where the justice who authored it sketched a sort of background, of the legal history, the moral and constitutional history of the right to own a gun. And my paper was cited in sort of that summary of why individuals have a prima facie right to own a gun. And that's what I talk about in that paper. But it was interesting to see that paper just cited in a legal case. In
Yeah.
fact, right now, in the next few days or weeks, the Supreme Court the U.S. Supreme Court, not the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to rule in what's going to be a landmark case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin.
Hmm.
And that case concerns whether the state, or in this case, New York, can require someone to have a good reason before they carry or good reason or special need before they carry a gun. And that actually touches on an issue that I wrote about in 2017 in one of my papers titled The Ethics of Gun-Free Zones. And so it's interesting to see those ideas that I discussed
Yeah.
in my papers being directly now litigated, which I don't think the Supreme Court's going to cite my paper, but it'd be cool if they did.
Yeah.
But it's an issue that I identified all the way back in 2017, 2018, and wrote about because no one else in the philosophy ethics literature had written about it, and now it's coming to fruition as a landmark legal case. And so it's just really fascinating to see that the ideas I write about are actually being discussed, which, not to rib on philosophers, but I read a lot of papers, and sometimes they're on really obscure things that I wonder, well, I get it how this is important to a very narrow area of philosophy, but like, who's ever going to read this stuff?
Right.
And going back to what you were saying earlier, one of my pet peeves in reading philosophy papers, and you mentioned how, in conferences it's one-upmanship. I see a lot of philosophy papers where, the author will try to show off his knowledge of logical symbols, of logical operators, modal logic, and use all these fancy terms and symbols that, unless you're a trained philosopher, you're not going to understand any of it. And so I try to avoid any of that in my own writing. I try to keep it in a way that, look, somebody who's college educated, reasonably intelligent, could understand that. And my research has been cited quite a bit in places that I would never expect to see it. And so, to bring it all back to the court case, I am delighted to see that my research has been cited. Although it was in a dissenting opinion, it's not legally binding. It's good to know that at the highest levels, my research is being digested, and maybe one day it'll be in a majority opinion.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, you had mentioned gun-free zones then. Thinking about the ethics of gun-free zones, there ought to be certain places where there should be no guns. Maybe the only place to have guns is at the gun club, maybe in your home. What is your reasoning for why we should be able to carry weapons in most public places, and what places shouldn't we be allowed to carry it?
So I see it as an extension of your right to own a firearm. If you have a right to own a firearm, one way of exercising that right is by carrying it. The purpose of a firearm is to help protect yourself and those around you whom you love, as well as other people. But to do that, you have to be able to bear it, to wield it. And carrying your firearm is just a natural extension of that. So my argument in that paper is that, look, if you have a right to own a gun, that implies a right to carry it, because carrying is a way of exercising ownership. And so if the government or the state wants to restrict that extension of that right in a specific area, then and as I argue in my paper, it takes on the responsibility of providing protection for me, because it has disarmed me through threat of coercion. I can no longer exercise a right to defend myself, and as such, it has handicapped me with respect to the ability to make a effective defense of myself. And so, if I encounter a situation in one of these zones where I am in danger, it stands to reason that the government bears that responsibility of protecting me, because it has told me that I cannot protect myself in that way. It's analogous to if I'm giving you a swimming lesson, you don't know how to swim, and I push you out in the deep water and you start flailing around and starting to drown. I owe it to you to save you, because I have put you in a position where you're not able to take as good care of yourself as compared to if I didn't do that. And so I have that special responsibility of rendering care to you. It's in the legal world, this is known as the state created danger doctrine. If the government tells you you can't do something, and as a result you are put into danger and you incur harm, the government or the state is liable for that. And so the argument I make in my paper, The Ethics of Gun-Free Zones, is that if the government is going to tell you you can't carry in a specific area, the government must provide equivalent security to the security you
And
would have had.
isn't that what they do? They provide police, right? That's what you're for.
Well, police can't always be everywhere that they should be. In fact, most police responses are after the fact. In fact, as I say in one of my papers, the data shows that most police responses come about 10 minutes after the call's put in. By then, it's too late. By then, people could be hurt, people could be injured, the assailant could have gotten away. And so the presence of a normal police force isn't going to be enough. If the government's going to meet that responsibility, they're going to have armed guards at every corner, which for many people is a step too far. Many people are afraid of government authority these days, ironically, which if you're afraid of government authority, if you're afraid of the police, if you're afraid of that, why not encourage more self-reliance? It's sort of an interesting inconsistency in leftist thinking on this topic.
Yeah, it would require a massively armed statist police force. You feel like it's just an authoritarian police state, like images we used to have in the old Soviet Union with people carrying, military weapons everywhere, and it's impractical.
The only places where this requirement would be met would be probably like the White House or Fort Knox, but your average, grocery store or even a school, these requirements are not met. And so, it's a very high bar. If the government wants to say, you can't defend yourself, then it better provide me with equivalent means of self-defense. Otherwise, the government is violating my right to defend myself.
Right. And well, what about levels of force with respect to weapons? I mean, shouldn't some of them be off limits?
In principle, I don't see a reason for that. And now I'm speaking in principle here. If imagine a scenario like the one in Independence Day, right, where alien invaders, the governments have collapsed. I could see in an extreme situation like that warrant for allowing individuals to own weaponry that normally would be reserved for governments. If you live in, say, the Middle East or some places in Africa, I think it's entirely reasonable to say that you should have access to a fully automatic or select fire rifle, and maybe even some grenades and rocket launchers. If you're in Ukraine right now, I think it's very plausible that individual citizens can be given, say, RPGs or grenades to use in defense of themselves and others. And so there is no theoretical, or there is no, I guess I should say, law of nature that says you can't use a certain weapon. As long as the situation warrants it, you can use a nuclear weapon if you want. Now, those situations are vanishingly low. And so I do think that, look, if you want to obtain more dangerous weaponry, it's reasonable to say that you have to jump through more hoops. But I'm not ready to say that there's an in principle reason not to own, say, a Browning M2 or an M1's Abram tank. I think right now, given the context I'm in, the one that you're in, I think the weapon that could serve the most effective purpose for us, given the kinds of threats we would be expected to face, would be something like a handgun or an AR-15. But again, if I were in Ukraine, if I were living under the threat of ISIS, it's not ridiculous to give me a machine gun. In fact, I would probably want a machine gun if that were the case here.
Something with 10 rounds is just not going to do it in some cases, especially as you pointed out in one of your papers. If you have multiple assailants,
Yep.
you've got to have more than that.
Well, with all the mob violence and rioting we've been
Mhm.
seeing, the past few years, I feel very secure having a 30-round standard capacity magazine for my AR-15, given the amount of people that, might suddenly show up on your property at once. Having that amount of ammunition is a good thing. I think in New York State, I think they limited it a few years ago to 7 or 8 rounds.
Hmm.
I would not feel very confident with 7 or 8 rounds. Police officers carry anywhere from 15 to 17 rounds as their standard capacity. 15 is actually on the low side. I think standard is around 17. I carry a 15 round magazine, but I've got 17 rounders as my reloads.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the idea too, not just self-defense, but from a Christian vantage point, we're thinking about defending the innocent. As a military police officer, our motto was to protect and defend. Well, not just protect myself and defend myself, but what if you're in an area where everyone else is just utterly defenseless? By the time the police get there, the deed is done, and multiple people could be dead. And so we think about this in terms of, loving people as well. Love wills the good of the other. I would, if I could, I'd shoot in the kneecap. I would shoot to wound. I would, bring what I need to the fight just to do the job rather than overkill. But if necessary to protect and defend the lives of the innocent against the guilty, there seems to be some moral obligation there, doesn't there?
Yeah, and it's not as if we're out wanting to kill someone. No one who carries a gun who I know says, "Oh, I'm going to concealed carry today, hoping that I can kill a perp." Like,
Yeah,
no one wants to put themselves in that situation. The point of having a gun is so that you can stop a threat, that you can protect yourself and those whom you love. You don't go out there looking for violence. If you do that, then I think you cross the line. You become a vigilante. The goal is simply to stop a threat.
right.
And look, if I put 3 bullets into someone and they're no longer a threat, I'm not going to keep shooting, because they're down, they're out of the fight, and you know I've done my job. And so it's easy to think that because of how lethal a gun is, that people who own a gun are out there for blood. They're out there to kill people. But ask the vast majority of gun owners, they just want to protect themselves. They just want to protect their kids. They want to protect those whom they love. They're not out there picking a fight. And if you are out there picking a fight, the law will treat you as such. Will treat you as
Right.
an aggressor. But I hope that I never have to shoot someone. The trauma from shooting that is something that I hope no one ever has to deal with.
Right.
But it's an expression of love. I mean, how could you sit and watch those whom you love get attacked, wounded, even killed, and not do anything to
Can't do
defend them? I
anything.
think that's a failure of love. And it's also, you might think, a way of loving the assailant too. You don't want the assailant to uh, sort of, hurt himself, to damage, his relationship with the community. And so using force, restraining someone, doesn't even have to be shooting them. It's also a way of loving your enemy too, because you care enough about them that you don't want them to do bad things, and so you stop them. Sometimes that involves, unfortunately, them dying as a side effect. But the goal is never to kill someone. Uh, Something that I mentioned in the paper is the principle of double effect. And the
Hmm.
principle of double effect basically says that, look, some of our actions are going to have side effects that are bad. And that's okay, provided those bad effects aren't directly intended, and that the bad effects are there as they're proportionate to the good effects. The good effects and the bad effects are proportionate, and you can intend the bad effects. And so shooting someone to save a life, I would say that's proportionate. I'm not wanting them to die. I'm hoping that, when I pull out my gun, to stop a bad guy, I hope that that's enough to stop them in their tracks. I'm not, wanting to pull the trigger, but if they keep coming at me, I'm going to pull the trigger because I have no other choice. And so, you talk to most people who carry guns, that's going to be a last resort. You never want to
Right.
shoot your gun, but there are cases where you're going to have to do it. And, it can be something that's perfectly loving to yourself, to those whom you love, and even to the bad guy.
Right. And I appreciate you bringing that point up. I thought that was an irony in that Wisconsin Supreme Court case that the judge really pressed the issue when he was talking to the person who shot the other one, saying, I think that people who acquire guns get changed. They get transformed from the inside out. And it's as if all of a sudden they become animals and they want to go kill people. And that was one of the pushbacks I think that the dissenting opinion was looking at is, look, you can't just assume that someone who has a gun wants to go kill someone or that somehow it makes them think they're Rambo. Most people who own weapons, including police officers, if that was the case, then it would make police officers, animals with fangs, and they're just looking for people to kill as well. If you've got proper training, and most people who hold guns have at least got some kind of training, you're going into it with the right point. You don't want to go shoot someone to kill someone, maybe to wound them, maybe just to deter them. But at the end of the day, you're called to protect and defend the innocent. And also, you have the moral right to defend the self. Well, why do you argue that the wrong way in another paper that you have to think about gun control is weighing outcomes in a utilitarian kind of a cost-benefit analysis, statistics? And why do you think that weighing outcomes in that way is wrong? And what is the right way to think about gun control?
Well, the short answer is that utilitarianism is wrong. The longer answer is that utilitarianism focuses chiefly on just weighing the costs and benefits, and it doesn't take into account rights. And if you read the literature on moral rights are regarded as what are sometimes called, and this is borrowing a term from the legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin, they're called trump cards. A right is supposed to defeat appeals to negative utility. So, for example, you may not harvest my organs, even if it means saving 10 people. Saving 10 people might be a beneficial outcome. It might outweigh that one life, but my right not to be killed, my right to keep my organs, doesn't allow you to do that. And so, what utilitarianism doesn't take into account, and many people, and it's easy to sort of slip into utilitarian thinking. It's intuitive in the sense that you look at policy proposals, think tanks, politicians. They'll often appeal to numbers, studies, and all that kind of stuff. Nothing wrong with that, but we have to remember numbers aren't the only game in town. And sometimes appealing to numbers can obscure important rights that aren't being discussed. And so I think, the right to life and rights that are derived from that are absolute and weighty in a way that cannot be defeated by appeals to negative consequences. And so, you read the literature on gun control, it's often framed in terms of, do guns help more or do guns harm more? Do guns save more lives or do guns take more lives? That's, you read John Locke, more guns, less crime. You read the other side, David Hemingway, for example. It's all about, what are the numbers, where do they stack up? And I do think that as far as the numbers game go, I do think that guns, and there's a lot of data on this, and I talk about it in some of my papers, I do think that guns save a lot more lives than guns take. But that's not the basis of my argument. The basis of my argument is that each individual has the right to take their life into their own hands. We are all our own last lines of defense. And so, look, even if restricting guns, banning guns for everyone, even if that would save X number of lives, we still have the moral right, and arguably in some cases the obligation, to defend ourselves using the most effective means possible. Sure, it might overall reduce the number of homicides, suicides, accidents, and so on. But the basis for owning a gun isn't the overall security it provides to society. It's the fact that each individual has the right to provide for their own defense. Moreover, as I mentioned in one of my papers, you can care about the numbers and you can care about rights in a way that, so for example, instead of banning guns for everyone, you might say that, well, okay, certain people are unqualified, and they're not the kind of people we want to own guns, and you can restrict those people from owning guns while allowing the vast majority of people who are law-abiding the ability to own guns. So I don't have a problem, for example, with banning former criminals or felons from owning firearms. But what the law can't do is it can't assume that everyone is unqualified and require them to prove they're qualified. We don't treat self-defense that way. We don't say, no, you can't call the police until you show that you're qualified to
Right.
Or sorry, we don't tell people, no, you have to call the police until you're able to show to us that you're able to defend yourself on your own terms. We let people take their own lives into their own hands because that's a prerogative that we all have as individuals. And so, look, I think the consequences, the numbers are important, but they're not the only game in town. And certainly we should take them into account, but they're not decisive. And I make this case in several of my papers and several of my op-eds. It's a long argument I give that I'm not going to go into detail here.
Well, thanks for taking the time. Tell us what your website is if people want to check out some of your papers, Tim.
So my website is my first name, Tim, my last name, Hsiao.org. My last name
How do you spell that?
hard to spell. So H as in Henry, S as in Sam, I as in Ida, A as in Adam, O as in Ocean. So timhsiao.org. And I'm sure once you post this, you can include you're able to include the link on the bottom or in the description or something like that.
Sure.
It's on YouTube, I suppose.
Yeah. And we want listeners, viewers of this to check out our YouTube channel, subscribe to that, and look at Tim's website as well. Thanks for joining us, Tim, for this episode of Thoughtful Christianity and on God and Guns. More to come later.